This is a CBS News special report. I'm John Dickerson with Norah O'Donnell and Gayle King in New York. We welcome those of you watching on CBSN. Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report on the Russia investigation has just been made available to the American public. The Justice Department released a redacted version of the Mueller report, meaning some of the material was removed as required by law.
Now, Congress also just received the redacted report just a short time ago. They actually got it on a CD-ROM after Attorney General William Barr summarized it at a news conference. You can see we are actually printing the report here, getting it to us. It's color-coded. Now, Barr, in his press conference, said the evidence does not support accusations that the president obstructed the Mueller probe and found no collusion with Russia by any American, he said. Now, just of course, as this report is being released, look, Gayle, we see the President of the United States enter into the East Room of the White House.
Yeah, and it was still unclear if the president was going to speak today. He said he might have something to say. My guess is that he will come up with something to respond to Mr. Barr's press conference this morning. Let's listen to the president.
Soldier ride is something very, very special. Few people could do it, including me. I hate to admit it. I hate to admit that, General, but including me. We're deeply honored to be in the presence of true American heroes. I want to thank our great Vice President, Mike Pence, and Karen Pence for being with us today. Thank you, Mike and Karen. Stand up. Mike, stand up. And theirs is really a fierce devotion. I can tell you that, speaking, I deal with Mike and Karen, and they have a fierce...
CBS News legal analyst Jonathan Turley joins us once again at the table. Let's discuss, Jonathan, what we've seen so far this morning with Mr. Barr's press conference.
Well, thus far, we have some new information. One is, interesting issue is that there was a disagreement as to what constitutes obstruction of justice between the prosecutors and the Attorney General. The Attorney General made some reference to the fact that he accepted their definition of obstruction in deciding that it would not make a plausible criminal case. That indicates that they did not accept Barr's more narrow definition of that crime. We also have the description of these 10 episodes that the...
Let me just pause you just for a moment, just as we are just getting this report that's been released to the public. Paula Reed covers the Justice Department and the White House for us. She has read through some large sections of this report. Paula, your headlines.
One of the most remarkable things that I saw in here, Norah, was we are getting for the first time the president's reaction to being informed by his former Attorney General Jeff Sessions that Special Counsel Robert Mueller had been appointed. Quote, President Trump said, "Oh my God, this is terrible. This is the end of my presidency. I'm, quote, effed." He said, quote, "Everyone tells me if you get one of these independent counsels, it ruins your presidency. It takes years and years and I won't be able to do anything. This is the worst thing that has ever happened to me." And Norah, what's also interesting is in this report, we're learning more about the pressure that the president applied on his attorney general when he got wind of the fact that he may recuse himself from the Russia investigation. This report also confirms that the president tried to convince his attorney general to recuse himself. But so far in going through this, that was the most remarkable passage, just seeing how rattled the president was when he learned that Special Counsel Robert Mueller was going to look into any ties between Russia and his campaign.
And the president also, according to the report, told his attorney general at the time, Jeff Sessions, according to Sessions' recollection, the president said, quote, "You were supposed to protect me," which suggests, again, gets to this idea. This is one of those events, undoubtedly. And what's interesting about what Paula read is the president said he's in trouble hearing that the special counsel was named. But it's unclear whether he said, "I'm in trouble because something was done wrong," or "I'm in trouble because this is going to pin down my administration for years and years and I'm not going to be able to get anything done."
That's right. That goes to the question of intent. Right. And it was clear that the prosecutors felt they could not make that determination. Now, there might be a slight peevish aspect to this. You know, the prosecutors wanted to hear from the president himself. The president declined to be interviewed. And the prosecutors at the end of the day said, well, look, we can't resolve what your intent is. You didn't speak to us. All we have are these very disturbing questions. But that still gets to this issue of self-inflicted wounds, that the president left every impression of someone who wanted to scuttle the investigation. You know, he's that guy that runs every time a car alarm goes off.
There are so many disclosures in this 400-page report. Let's go back to Paula Reed, who has been reading through that report. Paula, what else have you learned?
Norah, one of the most surprising things to me was how lightly this report has been redacted. There's very little of this that we can't actually read. But one of the most interesting things, it's all the way at the end in an appendix that talks about other investigations that this investigation has launched. That is really the only place that we saw any redactions. You see almost 3 pages of total redactions, which means they could not share this information with us because these are ongoing cases. So if anyone thinks this is the end of the special counsel's investigation or the headaches that it has caused the president, the redactions that I'm seeing in here suggest otherwise. One other really interesting note is there was a whole section here about why they decided not to subpoena President Trump. And in this, special counsel Robert Mueller said that he knew he had the power to do this, but it would likely cause a lengthy legal battle. And he didn't want to, quote, delay the conclusion of this investigation, because a lot of people have wondered why they didn't subpoena the president and force him to answer additional questions beyond the written answers that he submitted. But those written answers were only about Russia. He didn't answer any questions about obstruction of justice.
Paula, let me just ask you quickly, did Mueller say in the report that Congress still has the ability to find that the president obstructed justice?
I didn't see that specifically. Now, it's hundreds of pages. I was skimming and I was looking for very specific things. But I mean, it is true that the Congress can technically hold a trial. They can impeach the president. And one of those crimes that he could potentially be impeached for would potentially, if there was evidence, be obstruction of justice. And the Attorney General was asked earlier, why didn't you just pass this question off to Congress? If Special Counsel Robert Mueller couldn't come to a conclusion, why could you? And interestingly, Attorney General Barr said that he believed it was his mission to make a decision, even though the special counsel left that as an open question. Barr just didn't see it as an option to hand this off to Congress.
All right, Paula Reed, thank you. We'll be going back to Paula in a minute. I just want to, one piece from the Mueller report here that concerns an important important moment in the drama here was the question of the firing of James Comey. James Comey felt like the president had fired him because Comey was finding something out in the investigation. Robert Mueller says this: evidence indicates the president wanted to protect himself from an investigation into his campaign. In addition, the president had a motive to put the FBI's investigation behind him. The evidence does not establish that the termination of Comey was designed to cover up a conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia. So on the collusion question, that clears the president. Evidence indicates the president wanted to protect himself from an investigation into his campaign, gets into this murky question again. In other words, he wanted to protect himself, but why? Did he want to protect himself because it was going to clot up his administration for years and years, or because he thought they might find something? Mueller says here what Mueller concluded was that the president was not worried about finding out about a conspiracy between Trump and the Russians.
Well, that's what makes Trump such an enigmatic figure historically, is that much of this was by his own hand. Had he not fired Comey, the Russian investigation looked like it was winding down, and then it metastasized into a global investigation, tied up his entire administration. That's precisely what he was told would happen. And so it's a baffling aspect to all this, that his inclination to counterpunch almost succeeded in counterpunching his way into an obstruction case.
Yeah, Jonathan, they seem to be fighting so hard all along the way. What was the purpose of fighting so hard? You know, you always hear people who have nothing to hide nothing, and it seemed like they were trying to hide a lot. At the end of the day, what does this mean?
Well, it may mean that Trump is Trump. You know, he's this very difficult study of what motivates him. He has these instincts that, quite frankly, are often wrong. You know, if the report is true, and we're still going through the report, that he wanted to fire critical players, he was only protected from a criminal case by essentially his staff creating a meat shield around him to try to keep him from firing someone and making the Comey thing look like a walk in the park. So what's fascinating about this is that you have someone who, according to the Department of Justice, did not commit an underlying crime in collusion or conspiracy with the Russians, but then took so many steps that influenced and in many people's view harassed the investigation, that he made a plausible case of obstruction. So we'll have to see more about those details. But of these 10 episodes, the prosecutors were clearly looking for linkages. Is there a pattern here? What is the mosaic? And they do indicate that they think that the consistent motivation here seems to be Trump trying to avoid the costs of an investigation, that he wanted someone to sort of rid him of this meddlesome prosecutor. Mm-hmm. And his statement about Sessions is so maddening in that sense, because he seemed to believe that his attorney general was really there to, quote, protect him.
All right, Paula Reed, we'll go back to you. I understand you have more on what the president had to say. What are you hearing?
Well, what's so interesting is they included the president's full written answers to questions from the special counsel in this report. When I woke up this morning, this was the #1 thing I was looking for, because this gives us a sense of the president when facing the possibility of criminal charges for lying to federal investigators. What would be his version of events in terms of communications between Russia and his campaign? Now, he said in his answers he denied having any knowledge of the Trump Tower meeting where his son-in-law, his campaign chairman met with a Russian attorney promising dirt on his opponent. There have often been questions about whether or not that could happen without then-candidate Trump knowing. But in his answers, he denies knowing about that meeting. He also says that he had no recollection of being told ahead of time that Wikileaks was going to release emails that would be damaging to the Clinton campaign in October 2016, one of those Wikileaks dumps. He denies having any knowledge of that. And he also interestingly says he never discussed Russia or the Ukraine with his former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, who's, of course, currently in prison for not disclosing a lot of the work that he was doing on behalf of pro-Russia Ukrainian politicians. So I think this gives some interesting insight. It also helps explain why the president's personal attorneys were so comfortable having their client answer written questions about the Russia collusion aspect of this investigation, but not as comfortable having him answer any questions about obstruction of justice.
Thank you, Paula. You know, Jonathan, I think that raises a very interesting point, because so much has been made about this meeting with the Russians at Trump Tower with Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner was there, and people who know Donald Trump say there is no way that there could be a meeting in Trump Tower about this particular subject and he know nothing about it. He writes it down and says, nope, I knew nothing about it. So do we just take the president at his word? That's how this works?
Well, we might have to, unless there's countervailing evidence. But the problem with the Trump Tower was always it was rather implausible that the Russians were colluding with the Trump campaign and met in the Trump Tower with half the world's media downstairs, with people they didn't know who would be in the meeting, and they ultimately didn't produce anything. So there was always a disconnect in terms of the logic here.
And let me just add one quick thing on that point. The next question then is, well, did he want to obstruct efforts to find out about that meeting? And the Mueller report says, the evidence does not suggest that the president intended to prevent the special counsel's office or Congress from obtaining the emails setting up the June 9th meeting or other information about that meeting. So that's what the report says about the obstruction piece of that.
Mm-hmm. All right, as the Attorney General has said, that Mueller found no collusion by the President of the United States or members of his campaign with the Russians. We saw the president just a short time ago in the East Room of the White House. He was speaking with wounded warriors, but he did address essentially the contents of what has now been disclosed to the American people. Let's listen.
And they're having a good day. I'm having a good day, too. It was called No Collusion, No Obstruction. There never was, by the way, and there never will be. And we do have to get to the bottom of these things, I will say. And this should never happen. I say this in front of my friends, wounded warriors, and I just call them warriors because we just shook hands and they look great. They look so good, so beautiful. But I say it in front of my friends, this should never happen to another president again. This hoax. This should never happen to another president again. Thank you.
Weijia Zhang is at the White House. Weijia, it was reported yesterday by some outlets that White House staffers were nervous and in a panic. Are they nervous and in a panic today?
I think after that press conference from the Attorney General, they had a short time to at least calm down and realize that it was a good day for the president, as we just heard him say. However, of course, there are reading teams in place here, just like we have. Papers are flying off of printers, and we're going to have to go through word for word to see just how much information, how many of the details and nuggets about the president and his actions could be ultimately, negative for him. But, during events like this, where the president is in right now, in the East Room, typically he sticks to the script. He does not break, especially when he is surrounded by veterans, and he does not address the news of the day. But it is very significant that he made an exception because he's not just speaking to this room. If you look at the language he used the word hoax, he used his catchphrases, no collusion, no obstructions. He is clearly talking again to his supporters and saying to them, look, you were right. This entire time that you were standing by me and I was promising you there was no collusion and no obstruction, today is my day of vindication because now you have this 400-page report. And even though there are details in there about me that are not positive, I decided to withhold executive privilege and allow you to see all of it. As Paula just mentioned, she was surprised that so much of it was not redacted. So not only is he able to say, these are the conclusions, he's able to say, I want you to see all of it, and I want you to understand why Mueller came to this report. Of course, the relationship between the Trump supporter and this information is very tricky, and people are going to have to digest this on their own and see if it influences them going forward. But I did speak to sources here who say they don't think this is going to cost a single vote. In fact, they believe this is going to help the president. As we've seen, it has emboldened him. It has given him all the vindication that he's been looking for the past 2 years.
All right, Wei Zhang at the White House. Paula Reed has a statement from the president's lawyers. Paula?
That's right. This is a lengthy statement I've just received from the president's personal legal team. It goes on to recount a lot of what's happened today. But the headline here is they believe this is, quote, vindication of the president and an important step forward for the country and a strong reminder that this kind of abuse must never be permitted to occur again. Now, it's important to remember that earlier today, the Attorney General had a press conference before any of us had had a chance to see this document. And I noticed that his remarks were quite complimentary and empathetic to the president. And I asked him about that. I said, I was surprised to see in here that you went out of your way to say this was an unprecedented situation for any president. They talked about the anxiety that he felt. They talked about how difficult this would have been for him. And they also said, the Attorney General said, that in no way did the president try to interfere with this investigation, which I believe is sort of belied by the fact that he has dangled pardons in front of several different witnesses in this case. So I thought today Attorney General Barr's remarks were quite generous to the president, and I asked him what he would say to Americans who believe he is trying to help or protect the president with a speech like this, or his comments about spying on the Trump campaign, which the president is now fundraising off of. He did not answer that question.
All right, thank you, Paula. We have more information from the report on page 79, referring to Jeff Sessions, Jonathan. He says, the president then told Sessions he should resign as Attorney General. Sessions agreed to submit his resignation, and he left the Oval Office. The next day, May 18, 2017, FBI agents delivered to McGahn a preservation notice that discussed an investigation related to Comey's termination and directed the White House to preserve all the relevant documents. Before this, the president told Sessions, you left me on an island. 2 days later, the president told advisors he decided to fire Comey. What does all of that mean or say to you?
Well, this is part of the perils of being a counterpuncher. You know, the president's inclination at every stage so far we've seen in this report is to, frankly, flail about. And his response to Sessions recusing himself, which was the correct thing to do, is I'll fire Sessions. But what's troubling is this idea that he has that his attorney general is his attorney general, that the attorney general represents him. Even the White House counsel doesn't represent him, represents the White House itself. So this inclination that we see throughout this report is so damaging, not just to himself, but to his office. And you can see in the report, staffers trying to hold him back.
Does he sometimes punch when he doesn't need to?
Oh, absolutely. But most of the damage here is self-inflicted. Absolutely.
And it comes from, and isn't this the crucial question, whether he just doesn't know how the system works? Or, he looks at Bobby Kennedy and thinks, well, Bobby Kennedy was in there working for Jack Kennedy when he was Attorney General, so why isn't Sessions doing that for me? Or, and this was the crucial question, or he knows how the system works and he's trying to get around it.
The president had a critical part in his life in real estate, in the real estate market in New York. He had Roy Cohn as his attorney, who is a rather infamous character as a lawyer, who really taught him that you should always counterpunch, you should never apologize, you should always attack. Yes. Of course, that led to Roy Cohn dying bankrupt and disbarred. But the president has always had this idea that you have to attack, attack, attack. Well, that may be good for New York real estate, because that certainly is a signature of that market. It is not good for the President of the United States. So the question, when we look at this report, when we look for example, impeachable conduct, is whether the president was trying to do something that was a crime, but not allowed to do so. And that raises a tough question. If the president wanted to take a criminal act, but staffers prevented him from doing so, is that something that Congress needs to think about?
So could it be that his behavior is at times distasteful to some? It's not illegal.
That's right. I mean, he stayed short of the criminal code. That's not a huge recommendation. But clearly the prosecutors did not believe that there was a case to be made. It's also notable that much of what the special counsel looked at were in fact his public tweets, were in fact the public statements that he made. So he was doing this in the open. I mean, he was not someone who was concealing much. Mm-hmm. So what comes out of this report is that this is a guy that really does play poker with the cards facing outward. I mean, he attacks.
I should also note one other thing the investigation found is that on this question of Michael Flynn, the president's former national security advisor, and whether Flynn was having conversations with Russia about sanctions the Obama administration had put on Russia. The Mueller report says our investigation accordingly did not produce evidence that the president knew about Flynn's discussions of sanctions before the Department of Justice notified the White House of those discussions in late January 2017. The point being that if the president didn't know about Flynn's discussions with the Russians, how could he have been trying to block our efforts to find out about those discussions?
Right. In fairness to President Trump, a lot of people don't understand, if you're not colluding with the Russians, how come there's so many Russians around? You're meeting them in hotels, staffers are meeting them. The fact is, this is Washington, D.C. Diplomats reach out to people. They try to create back channels. And so a lot of folks made that into a mosaic of a collusion conspiracy. And what comes out of the report is, no. I mean, a lot of this was insular types of back channel communications. The Russians were very incensed by the sanctions that were imposed against them on things like adoption, and they kept raising that with critical figures.
We are all going through this report now. It is extensive. It is online. We're reading through much of it and distilling it. Paula Reed is at the Justice Department, has been covering this probe from the beginning, and I know you're going through it as well. What else have we learned?
Norah, what I'm seeing starting to emerge is a tale of two presidents. The president's forward-facing approach to this investigation here to the press, dismissing it as a witch hunt, trying to undermine it in the court of public opinion, but behind the scenes really encouraging cooperation and transparency with investigators. And one really interesting example of that is when the story about the Trump Tower meeting started to become public. Apparently, the president encouraged his son-in-law and his press representative, Hope Hicks, at the time, not to talk about it, just to leave it alone, and not to discuss it with the New York Times, which is working on a story. And Hicks told investigators, she said she thought this was very unusual because, quote, the president usually considered not responding to the press to be the ultimate sin. So she found it noteworthy that the president did not want to be transparent about that Trump Tower meeting or any emails or how that was set up with the press. But later on in the investigation, he encouraged his son-in-law's attorneys, he encouraged Hicks and others to be completely forthcoming with investigators. I think it is an interesting tale of sort of both sides of the coin and how he's played this investigation in the public eye, while behind the scenes seeming to follow some pretty good legal advice, which is full disclosure.
All right, Paula Reed, thank you. The report is out, as you know. We've just gotten our first copy. Yes. Nora.
Oh, I'm sorry. We are looking at this report together here.
This is our first copy. This is volume 1. It's 196 pages. What were you all looking at before we go to Nancy Cordes?
We're talking about the president's intent, which has been important in this. And there's a part on page 60 that Jonathan can read from.
Yeah, and this is just the first part of this on collusion. But it says, as described above, the evidence does not establish that the president asked or directed intelligence agency leaders to stop or interfere with the FBI's Russian investigation. And the president affirmatively told Comey that if some satellite was involved in Russian election interference, it would be good to find that out. So that is different from some of the accounts that we read earlier, where he approached cabinet members to try to get them to intervene. Here, Mueller is saying that he really did, whatever actions he took, was not to stop the investigation.
Well, and it's funny because the president, having called the investigation a witch hunt, in that quote, is saying to Comey, if you find some satellites, meaning some people who work for his campaign or in his orbit, that he should go after them. So he was, in fact, basically essentially telling Comey, hunt for the witches.
And that's consistent in one other respect. If you look at what Comey testified and what other critical players said, the president was upset not necessarily with the Russian investigation as a whole, but in terms of Comey, but Comey's refusal to say publicly what he had told Congress, that Trump was not a target of the investigation.
Here's an interesting part of this, because should we go to Nancy Cordes first?
Yeah, I think we should go to Nancy Cordes on Capitol Hill, who also has a report. What are you hearing on Capitol Hill, the initial reaction, Nancy?
Well, initial reaction, Gayle, is coming down along predictable party lines. That's the reaction before most lawmakers have really had a chance to go through this report with a fine-tooth comb. Democrats castigating the Attorney General for his press conference this morning. I'll just give you a taste of it. Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut saying that it's a sad day for the Department of Justice because the Attorney General doubled down on protecting his boss rather than serving the American people. But then you've got the Republican leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, saying that the Attorney General is committed to transparency and the nation is lucky to have him, and that Leader McConnell is looking forward to reading the report. Across the Hill right now, you've got staffers who've got their reading glasses on and a big pot of coffee and are starting to go through this report, which was delivered old-fashioned style by manila envelope. We saw a woman in a black suit drop it off at the Judiciary Committee room right at 11 o'clock. But lawmakers across the country are getting into this report as well, because keep in mind, we are in the midst of a 2-week congressional recess right now. And it is probably no accident that this report is being released during that recess and right before Easter and Passover weekend, when it will be more difficult, frankly, for Democratic lawmakers to coordinate on a message in response to what you're hearing from the Attorney General and the President. The chair of the Judiciary Committee, for example, Gerald Nadler, has announced a press conference for this afternoon, not here at the Capitol, but at his home district in New York City. So you're not going to see what you would ordinarily see if Congress was in session, which is a lot of lawmakers running to the microphones and having big press conferences in a group, either here on Capitol Hill or in front of the Supreme Court. So that was probably a tactical decision made by the Attorney General, even though he is slated to testify about the report very quickly after Congress comes back into session in the beginning of May.
All right, Nancy Cordes, one of the things we're looking for, too, is whether there's any daylight between essentially how the Attorney General, William Barr, characterized this report and then what's actually in the report, correct? Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things as reporters and journalists we're all looking very closely at. One significant factor, the way that the Attorney General characterized it earlier, was that the President, the White House, was extremely cooperative. They didn't exert executive privilege. One of the things we're learning in this is that Mueller's team was very dissatisfied with the President and his written responses in terms of this probe, because remember, he gave those written responses. In this report that was just released, prosecutors called Trump's answers inadequate. We're learning now they did consider subpoenaing Trump for this, which had been reported contemporaneously at the time, but decided against it, weighing a long legal battle. But they also concluded they had other information. A second thing that we've learned of this, if you're reading through this, 2 important things. Volume 1 is going to be on collusion, which we know, of course, the Russians were involved in a massive effort to try and influence our election. The second is on obstruction of justice. So if you're looking to, and if you want to go quickly, you can use Control F in case we all forget those keys that we used to use back in the day. You can use that. So let me just start here. Let me read you from Volume 1, the introduction, this specific part that says, The Russian government interfered in the 2016 presidential election in sweeping and systematic fashion. We knew that. Then, the investigation, quote, identified numerous links between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. We knew that, right? These Trump Tower meeting later when he became president in the White House. But it says, although the investigation established that the Russian government perceived it would benefit from a Trump presidency and worked to secure that outcome, and that the campaign expected it would benefit electorally from information stolen and released through Russian efforts, the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated in that. And that's a really, because everyone's trying to understand, how did all these friendships, connections, meetings happen, and then it wasn't nefarious?
The important thing in that is we talked about our three different standards, the legal, the political, and then the congressional. Numerous links. If you listen just to the Attorney General, it sounds like there was no connection at all. There were numerous links. They just didn't break the law. And what he found also is there's no conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. But as we know, the material the Russian government got, it gave to Wikileaks. So it leaves very much open the possibility, and in fact, states explicitly that they expected to benefit from it, from this connection between Russian obtained information and the campaign. And that's in the political context and the congressional context where the conversation will now go, is that these connections took place. They weren't criminal, but they still existed. And so what do we feel about that as a country?
And even, Jonathan, if the optics don't look good, it doesn't mean that they did anything wrong.
That's right. I got to tell you, this is a fascinating read.
Yeah.
The degree to which the details of these meetings are being revealed without privilege. But there's a couple of interesting points. First of all, the report says that Rod Rosenstein did not object to the firing of Comey. There's always a question about what role his memo played. And
they viewed that's within his powers.
That's right. And it was reported that he was upset that the White House suggested that it was his memo that caused the firing of the president. What's fascinating here is that the special counsel is saying this was raised with both Sessions and Rosenstein, and they did not object to the firing of Comey. It also says, however, this. It says the act of firing Comey removed an individual overseeing the FBI investigation. It goes on to say firing Comey would qualify as an obstructive act if it had the natural and probable effect of interfering with or impeding the investigation. So they did find that the firing could be an act of obstruction, but then they went on to say, but it really didn't have that impact because nothing was done to stop the investigation.
Meaning that it could have had that impact irregardless, or I should say regardless, of the president's intent.
Well, it still will charge him. You still have to show corrupt intent. But that the act itself could be an act of obstruction. But they do, I mean, it's a very fair report. I mean, the Mueller does say, you know, but on the other hand, he went ahead and appointed McCabe that he knew was close to Comey. Right. And it didn't interfere with the investigation. I mean, so far I have to say, this is a much better report than I would have thought Trump could hope for. It has many embarrassing factors here.
Yeah. But are you surprised to hear that that Rod Rosenstein wasn't upset about the firing of Comey? Because it was widely reported that he felt he was being made the fall guy for the firing of James Comey.
Yeah, and the White House had to make that cat walk backwards. Yes. Remember? I mean, because it was they released that, and then suddenly there was a press conference, and even Trump himself came out and said, okay, it wasn't Rod Rosenstein that was the reason for this.
Oh. Let's go to one of the key details, of course, that Trump Tower meeting that happened that has been the focus of a lot of reporting. Paula Reed has been going through this report. Paula, what have we learned?
Nora, I'm literally working off of 2 phones just trying to get through all the details that we're learning. I mean, it's incredible. We're learning that the morning of the Trump Tower meeting, Rick Gates, the former deputy Trump campaign chairman, he recalled to investigators that morning Donald Trump Jr. announced to a senior staff meeting that they had a good lead on some damaging information about the Clinton Foundation. Because there have long been these questions about how much the campaign knew about this Trump Tower meeting and how willful they were in this pursuit of taking potentially damaging information about their opponent from someone linked to a foreign government. And here we're getting all these new details. Not only was this announced at a meeting where 3 of the president's 5 children were, Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump, and Ivanka, including Jared, his son-in-law as well, were allegedly all at this meeting. So they, according to this narrative, would have had some indication that this meeting was happening. But again, in his written answers to the special counsel, the president says he has, quote, no recollection of any advance knowledge that this meeting was happening, that they were trying to get this dirt on his opponent. This is really helping to flush out one of the key moments in this investigation.
The significance of that, do you think, the details of that meeting that were laid out?
For some people, this will just raise more questions about whether the president is just trying to wrap this in, oh, I have no recollection, but maybe he has some recollection, whether or not he's being honest. But for other people, this will look like an exoneration of the president. And they'll say, look, perhaps there were things that happened on that campaign that he didn't know about. Now, his former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, has testified about a time around then when he was in the president's office. He believed that the president's son, Donald Trump Jr., came in, whispered something to his father, that Michael Cohen believed was about the Trump Tower meeting, but he had no evidence to back that up. And of course, Michael Cohen is about to head to prison for lying to Congress. So it really kind of undercuts Cohen's narrative that in the president's written statement, he says he had no recollection, and there is no clear evidence in this report so far that the president had any advance knowledge of the Trump Tower meeting.
Okay, one major piece of news I think that's coming out of the Mueller report, and Jonathan Turley is nodding his head as well, is that we're learning that White House counsel Don McGahn refused to carry out President Trump's order to fire Mueller for fear of being seen as triggering another Saturday night massacre. We knew the president was angry with Mueller. Now it appears that his White House counsel said, you just can't do this. Essentially, as you said, tried to throw his body in front of the president from having this done. That would have been obstruction of justice?
Yeah, this is an extraordinary part of this report. You have a president of the United States giving a direct order to the White House counsel, and the White House counsel just saying no. I mean, I don't know how many occasions that has happened, but I expect there are very few. You serve at the pleasure of the president. And so here, McGahn gets this order that Mueller should be fired for a conflict of interest. Now, the Justice Department and the White House counsel, according to this report, sat down with the president and said, we've determined that his prior work in the law firm is not a conflict of interest, that there's no barrier to his continuing. But Trump still wanted him fired. So that gets us back to this question. If firing Mueller would have been an obstructive act, is being prevented from committing that crime something that Congress has to look at?
And to put this in a slightly larger context, you've had former members of the Trump administration, former Chief of Staff John Kelly, former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, Speaker Paul Ryan, said all of them considered a big part of their times in office was preventing the president from doing things that would have been disastrous. And this seems to fall in that same category.
Yeah, now, in fairness to the president, I think 2 things should be noted. One is Mueller repeatedly comes back to the point that Trump's primary point of anger with Comey was his refusal to say what he was telling everyone, that Trump was not a target of the investigation. And Mueller comes back to this time and time again and says that does appear to be the reason for his anger. And on the firing of Mueller, he does say that the president believed that Mueller was basically an improper choice by Rosenstein for the special counsel. It's not saying that he wanted to kill the investigation.
Goes right to that point of intent.
Right.
And now Weijia Zhang has some more reporting from the White House. Weijia?
Well, John, you know, as soon as we heard from Attorney General Barr, he really framed what this report was all about and reminded Americans that, look, the bad guy here is Russia. And he aligned the administration, Department of Justice, the president, the special counsel on one side and said, we are all standing up to the government, the Russian government here, which is at fault because this is really about them trying to meddle in our election. And I want to read from you findings from this report that In sum, the investigation established multiple links between Trump campaign officials and individuals tied to the Russian government. Those links included Russian offers of assistance to the campaign. In some instances, the campaign was receptive to the offer, while in other instances, the campaign officials shield away. Ultimately, the investigation did not establish that the campaign co-coordinated or conspired with the Russian government in its election interference activities. And we also are starting to get a clearer picture of the president's mindset through all of this. When he was being briefed about this, where he was. Just before that, what I read from you, there are pages that describe his former Deputy National Security Advisor, KT McFarland, telling him that they believe that the Russians interfered. Trump asked McFarland in a briefing if the Russians did it, meaning interfere in the election. McFarland said yes, but Trump expressed doubts that it had been the Russians. Trump told McFarland sanctions would give him leverage with the Russians. And of course, this brings us right back to that extraordinary moment when President Trump was standing next to President Vladimir Putin in Helsinki, and he very boldly seemed to take the side of Putin rather than his own intelligence community that had already made this conclusion and briefed him about it. And so even though he sort of tried to step back a few days later when he was back here in Washington, that chapter is still a dark cloud over his presidency because it sent so many people who work for him, who are, in his administration, advising him on security matters, into a tizzy because they could not believe that he would not stand up to Putin when given the chance on such a world stage. Okay. And so I do think that these are really important conclusions and that sort of give us a little bit more information about where the president was throughout the investigation.
All right, Weijia Zhang at the White House. Thank you, Weijia. And Jonathan Turley is also finding some more tidbits in this report. Jonathan?
Well, it's really it's an amazing insight. During this whole process, we were all looking at this moment when McGahn was told repeatedly to fire Mueller. What's amazing is around page 86, it describes the president repeatedly telling McGahn to basically punch this guy's ticket and get him out. Mm-hmm. And McGahn calls one of his aides and says he's coming into the office to pack his things. I mean, it's as he tells his aide, look, he wants me to fire this guy. I'm going to come into the office and pack up. Mm-hmm. So you can see the tension here where McGahn understood. He just said no, not to one, but repeated orders of a sitting president.
But explain why this matters, because at the end of the day, it didn't happen. Don McGahn barred the door and said, no, you cannot do that. Mm-hmm. So if you're a supporter of President Trump or even a critic of President Trump, it didn't happen.
That's right.
So, okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is the bomb that didn't go off.
Exactly.
And it was not the Saturday night massacre.
Exactly.
That President Nixon carried out.
Which moves it into that third category, which is what will voters make of this? Is this the presidency as it should exist, and let's have 4 more years of it? Or is it not the presidency as it should exist, which is to say a president who is pushing for something and having to be restrained by his advisors? So it moves it into that third category.
What it shows is a president engaging in distinctly bad judgment, and judgment that really could have influenced the investigation, could have even stopped the investigation, but did not. But I have to say, for people that felt that there was a concern, Kenneth Starr said he felt this report would be some type of political hit job. It's not. I mean, it's actually a very balanced report, and it gives great credence to the president's motivations here. What's also interesting to me is that even though they say we can't say that there was a corrupt intent here, they go pretty far in saying that the president did seem to be motivated by how all of this looked, that he didn't want his administration tied up in a long investigation. And that really works to the president's favor.
Yeah, but I thought John raised a really interesting point just then. What kind of president do the voters want? Do you want a president where you have to have people around him to sort of block the doors to say, listen, Mr. President, you cannot do that, or else it seems like he would make very bad decisions?
Right.
What do you want?
And it goes back to Jonathan's point, which is people will say, well, sure, but the president was being inundated with all these false reports. He felt like he was being attacked from every corner. And so these were the legitimate acts of a president who felt besieged. That would be the rebuttal.
That's the problem with the president's Game of Thrones tweet, right? This is precisely what got him into trouble. And by the way, it doesn't help if you come off like, you know, King Targaryen, who wanted to burn them all, and a staffer stopped you from doing that, right? So it's not a good analogy. But it also shows that the president time and time again tried to manage this controversy and got it himself deeper and deeper into obstruction, because many people said, why would you do this? Why would you say that if you didn't have something to hide?
All right, stand by, Jonathan. Kim Whaley is a former assistant U.S. attorney and currently a professor at University of Baltimore School of Law. She worked for Special Prosecutor Kenneth Starr during the investigation of President Bill Clinton. Good morning. Good morning to you, Kim. So what does this report tell you about the question of obstruction?
Well, I think there's a distinction between Mr. Mueller's view of obstruction and Mr. Barr's view of obstruction, which can be, I think, clarified if you read Mr. Barr's letter from June 2018 to the White House. So one view of obstruction is, listen, I think the prosecutor is a meanie, and I'm going to do what I can to stop that investigation, to interfere with that investigation. That would be more of a Mueller-type view that Mr. Barr criticized prior to being appointed. The other view that seems to be Mr. Barr's view is that I think the prosecutor's a meanie, and if the prosecutor continues with what he's doing, I will get in trouble. Something will be uncovered that hurts me. My reading of this plain language of the obstruction statute 1512 is that certainly Mr. Mueller's view is legal within the bounds of what Congress set forth. And there is, I haven't had a chance to read the whole report like most people, but there are paragraphs in this report of outlining the attempts that Mr. Trump made to affect the course of the investigation. And you've spoken about some of them. He wanted to fire Mueller. Mr. McGahn stopped him. He wanted Corey Lewandowski to tell Jeff Sessions to publicly say that it was a very unfair investigation. That didn't happen. He encouraged people in the White House not to disclose emails of the infamous Trump Tower meeting in New York. So these are efforts to say, listen, I don't like this. I want to stymie it. I want to slow it down. And I think there's a huge legal question as to whether the fact that it wasn't actually completed somehow exonerates him from a crime. But the other point, and I think this has come up, is we have to be extremely careful about thinking about this entire project as a black and white thing, either exonerated or either guilty of a crime. There's a huge gray area, and the gray area involves the integrity of our democratic process and the integrity of the system. On collusion as well, the special counsel, first of all, says, listen, this is not collusion. We are not applying that definition. And Mr. Barr, unfortunately, did apply that definition this morning, which I think is confusing for people. The special counsel also says the Russians, quote, worked to secure the outcome of a Trump presidency, and that the Trump campaign expected that help. So on a very loose definition of, hey, wink and nod collusion, arguably that connection is something that maybe some voters would have a problem with. But the last piece I want to say is, at least for now, is that I commend Mr. Barr for the transparency here, for making it all public. He did not have to do that under the special counsel regulations. And transparency is how democracy works. People that should read this themselves and make a determination. But the process here worked. And I also really take issue with people calling this a hoax or an abuse, because guess what? One thing that's very clear is that foreigners attacked the Russians attacked our electoral process. And that's the heart of our democracy, which is the heart of individual liberties in our country.
The president just said, Kim, that he's having a very good day, no collusion. This was a witch hunt. Does he have reason to feel pretty good today, in your opinion, based on what you've seen so far?
Yeah, sure. That's a political question. I think, he did handpick an attorney general, Mr. Barr, who's very well regarded and respected as an attorney. But Mr. Barr has an extremely broad view of executive power. And I think his press conference this morning, how he's handling this, is basically shores up an imperialistic type view of the presidency, which scholars debate, but we all have to understand as a democratic process, if we shore up the power of the presidency, that amount of power goes to the next president, goes to the next president, goes to the next president. And I think that notion that president has the ultimate power over prosecutors, informed Mr. Barr's view of this, which is informing how the American public is going to see this entire narrative. A different attorney general, maybe even if Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein had been actually appointed and confirmed for that position, a different attorney general might have taken a more neutral stance, said, let the facts speak for themselves. There's evidence on both sides. I'm going to let this play out in the political process in the American sort of consciousness and through Congress. But Mr. Barr decided to essentially have Mr. Trump's back on it and frame it in a way that was very advantageous to him politically. But we cannot, I think, as Americans, just see this as all one way or all the other way, because that's not what 400 pages means. And of course, we also have thousands of information below that.
We'd stand by for just a moment. We want to go back to Paula Reed, who has been at the Justice Department and going through all the details in this. And Paula, one of the sections, too, deals with Wikileaks, which was damaging information that was released during the campaign that significantly hurt the Clinton campaign.
That's right, Nora. This is one of the more juicy aspects of this report I've come across so far. In this report, the special counsel confirms that Donald Trump Jr. had direct electronic communications with Wikileaks. Right, this is something that we're going to revisit now that there is a fight over the extradition of Julian Assange. But here in the report, the special counsel investigators lay out how Wikileaks reached out to Donald Trump Jr. through his direct message on Twitter. Initially, they flagged some damaging information they had received about candidate Trump, but then the conversation continues with Donald Trump Jr. asking them, hey, what's this Wednesday announcement that I hear about? And then also Wikileaks coming back at him, encouraging him and his father to amplify it, to tweet out some of their work, specifically against his rival. There have been a lot of questions about the extent to which the Trump campaign knew about Wikileaks' plans to obtain these emails and disseminate them in an effort to damage candidate Clinton, or whether or not they directly worked together. Because again, many of the emails that WikiLeaks released are believed by U.S. intelligence to have been hacked by Russian intelligence officers or Russians working on behalf of the Russian government. So this is pretty interesting that there is a direct line of communication between the president's son and WikiLeaks. But again, this was not enough for the special counsel to establish any conspiracy or collusion between the campaign and any foreign entity.
Thank you, Paula. And that's because, as the Attorney General said, for it to be illegal, the campaign need to have been participating in the actual hack itself. And WikiLeaks didn't even do the hack. It was handed the hacked material by the Russians, and that doesn't trip the law, but we have this political issue.
Right. Let's go back up here. Why did this start? Because we have a foreign government that is trying to crush our democracy, our system of government, the way we do things. That's why we're the greatest country in the world. One detail in this report that Jonathan has just found, too, is that did the president in any way try and limit the scope of this look at what Russia was doing to our democracy? And there's a key point there.
Yeah, page 97 actually has a rather damaging section on intent. It goes to the president's efforts to have Sessions limit the scope of the special counsel investigation. And one of the things the special counsel says is that it's telling that the president did not go through official channels, but instead used people like Corey Lewandowski to try to convey this information. But then it has this line. It says, substantial evidence indicates the president's effort to have Sessions limit the scope of the special counsel investigation to future election interference was intended to prevent future investigative scrutiny of the president's and his campaign's conduct. Mm-hmm. So there was actually a finding of substantial evidence that the president did take actions which were meant to limit the investigation. Okay. That explains why this was such a close question between the special counsel and Main Justice and the Attorney General.
About obstruction.
That's right.
Yeah, about obstruction on that particular matter moving forward.
Right.
Okay.
We're likely to hear that passage read repeatedly and from now on as we move into these other venues, which are more political and not by the strict definition of laws.
That's right.
So it certainly does raise some eyebrows and seems a little damaging, but at the end of the day, when you look at the bottom line of the report, as William Barr said repeatedly, no collusion, no collusion, no collusion, that he was cleared.
That's right. And some of the details here which attract obvious attention, like Don Jr. contacting WikiLeaks. Exactly. It's also important to keep in mind that half the world's media was contacting WikiLeaks to try to get that information.
All right. Much more to come on this. Jonathan Turley, thank you. Coverage will continue on our 24-hour streaming service, CBSN. You can watch it at cbsnews.com and download the CBS News app.
There will be more throughout the day on your local news on this CBS station. And tonight on the CBS Evening News with Jeff Glor for a full wrap-up of what we learned from the Mueller report.
In the meantime, go download the report so you'll be up to date when Jeff comes on the air at 6 o'clock. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Gayle King, John Dickerson, and Norah O'Donnell, CBS News New York.
For news 24 hours a day, go to CBSNews.com.